The book of Mark chronicles the last 3 years of Jesus here on earth. They were pretty intense years, to say the least. Since meeting John the Baptist, he was faced with temptations in the desert, performed miracles, healed people, gained followers, was transfigured and died a criminal's death, only to be raised from the dead. Why should all this matter to you and me? Join us for the last 3.
Have you ever thought about this idea that distance changes our perception of things? About this time last year, I took one of our pastors to Brazil. I don't know if you knew this about Crossbridge, but Crossbridge is a multi-campus, multi-site church. Here in Miami, we have 5 locations, and we have a location actually in São Paulo, Brazil. And so I went with Robert Guerrero. Is Robert here today? Is Robert here? I didn't ask his authorization to share this story, but I will put him on blast. You can do this kind of to your employees. So anyways, I take Robert to Brazil so that we can see the work in São Paulo. And immediately we get out of the airport, jump into this taxi, and the taxi drives us into the downtown area of São Paulo. We meet up with our campus pastor there, Pastor Hobson, and then we go to this favela where we see the work that we've been doing there for the past 3 years. We leave there, we go to a conference site where both Robert and I teach and speak. And then we're about to head out to dinner, and I asked him, hey, what do you think of São Paulo so far? Now, you need to understand this about Robert. Robert's Dominican. He was born in New York, but raised in the DR. And before moving to Miami, he spent several years in New York City in Manhattan. And so we're driving around, and I said, what do you think of São Paulo so far? And he says, oh, it kind of feels like Havana, and it feels like Santo Domingo. And I was like, what? Now, okay, if you're from the DR here today, I mean no disrespect, but I'm thinking to myself, man, São Paulo is one of the 3 largest cities in the world. Santo Domingo? So I said, hey, let's change our dinner plans. We were going to this restaurant to meet some people, and I called everybody up. Hey, we're gonna change our plans. And some of you here are from São Paulo, so I took him to this place. It's this building. It's the highest building in the city of São Paulo. It's called Terraço Italia. On the top of this building, there's a restaurant. It's a panoramic view. You see the whole city. When Robert came out of the elevator and he stepped into this glass window, okay, where he could have a view of São Paulo. This was not the actual picture. I found this picture somewhere in the internet, but he saw that at night. You look around, it's a 360 view, and as far as your sight can see, there's skyscrapers everywhere. And then he looks and he says, wow, Manhattan looks like a suburb compared to this. Because distance changes your perception of things. Just a little while ago, in this beautiful testimony that we heard, here we have an example of someone whose body was withering away while her soul on the inside flourished. The passage that we're going to read from today in the Gospel of Mark is a passage where Jesus has this tree in sight. And he has a perception of the tree as he looks at the tree from a distance. But as Jesus comes near this tree, as Jesus comes close to this tree, his perception of the tree changes. And so we find ourselves in Mark 11, and we're going to read 2 parts of Mark 11. We're going to read verses 12 through 14, and then verses 20 to 22. Will you follow along with me? On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And the disciples heard it. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree that had withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. And Jesus answered them, Have faith in God. This is the word of the Lord. At a distance, when you read this passage, you have this idea that Jesus is this short-tempered man, that he's this angry man that curses a tree for not having fruit in the season that the tree was not supposed to have fruit. What's going on here with Jesus that looks at this tree and preferred these words of judgment that caused the tree later on to wither? Well, like I said, distance changes perspective. And in this case here, in this story, what we must do is zoom out a little bit and understand this conversation that Jesus has with this tree in light and in lieu of two major events that are happening here in chapter 11. Prior to walking up to that tree, Jesus had just been in Jerusalem where he had been hailed the king by the Jews. Remember, the multitude welcomes Jesus as he rides on the fall, on this donkey, through the gates of Jerusalem. And they spread their cloaks on the roads, and they greet him with palm branches, and they say, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, after being hailed as king in Jerusalem, Jesus spends the night at a small town by the name of Bethany where he had friends. And the next day, Jesus returns to Jerusalem, this time to go into the temple once again. And it's on the way to the temple that the text tells us that Jesus was hungry. He sees this tree, and he approaches this tree, and he has this conversation. Now, what you would know also about the story in the temple is that when Jesus gets to the temple, he is shocked because they're doing business in the house of the Lord, and he turns the tables of the money changers, and he kicks them out of the temple. Another very strong and famous passage about Jesus. But this tree is right in the middle of these two events, and they shed light on what's happening in the heart, on the inside of the people that Jesus is ministering to. This passage is a parable. It's a living parable on the topic of spiritual vitality. It is meant to identify that which is really on the inside. This passage is here to help you see what is in your heart. And on Sundays, it's easy for us to come through the doors and looking great. And by the way, you guys are beautiful people because we're in Miami after all. But while you are thriving on the outside, it's very possible that you walked in today and you're withering on the inside. Therefore, the title of the sermon today is When Faith Withers. And so we're going to ask three questions. The first question we're going to ask is, what's the meaning of the tree? Secondly, we're going to ask, what's the problem with the tree? And then lastly, we're going to ask, is there any hope for withering trees? First, what's the meaning of the tree? If you're familiar with the Bible, if you're familiar with the first several books of the Bible, the Old Testament, Israel is the people of God, who God is in covenant and relationship with. And throughout the Old Testament, in many passages, Israel is depicted as a tree. Israel sometimes is depicted as a vine. You find that in Isaiah chapter 5. Sometimes Israel is depicted as an olive tree. And here, and in other passages, Israel is depicted as a fig tree. Now, this is not just a picture for the nation of Israel, but it's also how Jews saw themselves. This is deeply embedded into their identity, this idea of trees. So if you read Psalm 1, the life of a blessed person is depicted as a tree planted by the rivers of living water. And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, in chapter 5 of Galatians, encourages us to produce fruit, that if we have been born again, if the life of Christ is in us, if we have really had an experience of saving faith through Jesus Christ, then we ought to be producing fruit. And Paul would not have said that. Paul would have not brought up this imagery if we were not seen as trees. I remember last year going to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, and there is a garden of the righteous amongst the nations, where each tree has the name of a person. I don't know if you knew this, but in the turn of the 16th century, the Jewish were being persecuted in Portugal because of anti-Semitism amongst Christians. And in order to not be kicked out or killed or to have their businesses shut down, what they did is they changed their family names to names of trees. And so they changed their family name to Oliveiras. And they changed their family names to Figueiredo. And they changed their family names to Carvalho. And some of you are here today and you have tree names as your family name. And if you were to look back, way back, maybe you are of Jewish descent. Because trees are extremely connected to their identity as a people and their identity as individuals as well. Which means this is the point of this conversation. Jesus is not having a conversation with this tree. Jesus is not a crazy man talking to trees, okay? Jesus is not a tree hugger, okay? Jesus is having a conversation with Israel, and he's having a conversation with you and I, and the tree is a metaphor to get his point across. Have you noticed in the passage, in the last verse that we read in verse 14, that after cursing the tree, the text tells us that his disciples heard it. He said it so that they would hear it. He said it, and it's here so that you would hear it. It's about you. It's about me. This parable, it's about us. It's about the state of our souls. It's about the state of our hearts. How is your soul? How is your heart? You may look, again, great on the outside, but how is the inside? Are you flourishing on the inside? Or are you withering on the inside? Be honest and be real. That's the meaning of the tree. Now, what's wrong with the tree? What's the problem of the tree here in this passage? And why is it that Jesus speaks so harshly to this tree? Now you need to understand a little bit of the context here. I'm no specialist in botanics, but I did some research about figs in the Middle East and fig trees in the Middle East. And here's what I learned, and that is this, that right around this time of the year, in the spring, and this happens in the spring, notice that a few days later, Jesus is having the Passover dinner with his disciples. So this is happening right in the spring. Right around the spring, a fig tree in the Middle East puts out its first fruits. There are these like little nodules that come out before the leaves. And travelers back then, as they walked by or walked past these trees, they would stop and they would take these nodules and they would eat it because they were quite sweet and they were quite good. And so when Jesus looks at this tree from a distance, the tree is filled with leaves, that's what the text tells us. By then, those nodules should have been out. And so he goes to the tree, goes up to the tree, it's filled with leaves, but no nodules, which meant that there was something fundamentally wrong with the tree. If nodules had not come out, the real fruit would not come out as well. And so the issue with the tree is this. The problem is not that the tree was not bearing fruit. The tree's problem was not the lack of fruit, but corrupted roots. It was not connected to the source of living water that would allow it to flourish. What Jesus is saying here in this living parable to the nation of Israel and to us, based on the two events wherewith this story is right in the smack middle, is that if you make anything in life your main source of sustenance besides God, your life will also wither. I mean, here's the example of Israel. In the previous passage, right before he walks up to this tree, right before he sees this tree, The same multitude, you would know this, that claims that he is their king. The same multitude that hails him as the powerful ruler, Messiah come in the flesh. The same multitude that receives him with glory is the same multitude that less than a week later is crying for his execution and for his crucifixion. Why? Because Jesus did not deliver on their expectations. See, they did not want the power of God to come into their lives. They wanted Jesus to give them power. See, they did not love Jesus, and therefore they wanted him as king. They used Jesus for their own means and their own goods. And that's such a picture, a realistic picture of many of us here today. That is, we don't go to God to get God. We go to God to get things from God. We're not going to him to have more of him in our lives, but we want him to give the things to us that we judge are the things that will bring our life significance, worth, and meaning. We don't have him as our main source of living water. We have this idea of other sources of living water that we're saying, Jesus, help me to get to that source. And while we're doing that, we're moving away from him. See, if that is what characterizes your spiritual life, if that's what characterizes your prayer life, that's a great indication that you may be withering on the inside, that your faith is withering. And then look at the other exempt. The other example that we find where the story is right in the smack middle, right after that, right after having that encounter of the tree, Jesus goes into the temple. And he is angry. And the reason why Jesus acts the way that he does, the reason why his anger is justifiable is precisely because they had valued profit over people. Jesus kicks out the money changers from the temple, and he turns their tables because that patio, because that place was reserved for people from different nations to come in and find God and pray to God. And he says, how is it that the place where people are supposed to connect with God in prayer has become this crazy hippie fair? How come you guys value profit over the spiritual vitality of people? Get out of here. See, in the Bible, the order is this. You love God and you love people and you use things. But when our faith is withering, we reverse the order and we love things and we love material possessions, and then we use God and we use people for our own good. If that is the picture in your life, it may be that your faith is withering. But here's another thing as an indication that maybe this is the reason why you are withering. It's because you don't have the character of Christ that we see here as the king who rides through the gates of Jerusalem on a fall. You see the juxtaposition? He's not mounted on a horse like the powerful rulers of his days, but yet he is a king. We see glory in meekness in Jesus. In Jesus, we see power in weakness. We see humility and we see boldness. And if in your life there is a discrepancy between humility and boldness, if you're very brave but very arrogant, then the character of Christ is not being formed in you. If in your life you are supposedly very humble but have no courage, is because you have and you're suffering from a sense of low self-esteem. And maybe the character of Christ is not being shaped in you as well, which is an indication that your faith is not flourishing, that your soul and your heart is not flourishing, but that you are withering. You know, I hope at this point in the sermon you've been reflecting and you've been realizing that you may be suffering from the same condition that Israel was suffering. You may be suffering from the same condition that Jesus is trying to describe here in this conversation with this tree. And if that's the case, what Jesus says to the tree is poignant, because he says to the tree, may no one ever eat from your fruit again. You know, C.S. Lewis used to say this, that there's two kinds of people. The people that go to God and say, God, your will be done. And the people that God goes to them and says, your will be done. You want to live a life just for yourself? You want to connect your heart and your soul and your hopes to these false hopes, to these sources of water that you think will bring significance and meaning and joy in your life? Well, they won't. May you never produce anything ever again, because that's the way you want it. Jesus is saying to people like you and I, if you are disconnected from me, you cannot expect to flourish. So my question to you this morning is, what things in your life have become essential to you other than Jesus? Where are you going for living water right now in your life? See, there's many sources of water out there. Children, they are a source of water. It's refreshing when you're around them. Money is a source of water. Image is a source of water. Friends, a source of water. Even faith and religion is a source of water. But these things are not living water. They will not satisfy the deepest longings of your soul. They will not quench the spiritual thirst within, because eventually all sources, except for Jesus, they run dry. So, where are you going for living water? Is it Jesus? Or is it something or someone else? That leads us to point 3. If you have reached this point in the sermon and you're now pretty depressed, because you're like, yes, I am indeed withering. And you may be asking the question, is there hope for me? I want to tell you today that there is hope for you. There is hope for withering trees. Here's what I believe about this passage, that this is not a final judgment of Jesus over Israel. This is not a final judgment of Jesus over those who are withering on the inside. It's not. Because what we've seen up to this point in the Gospel of Mark, as James tells us, is that in Jesus, mercy always triumphs over judgment. So you are not done. He is not through with you. This is not the end. There's hope for you today. If that's you, there's hope for you today, because mercy in Jesus triumphs over judgment. And the reason why Jesus could be harsh to that tree, and he spoke boldly to that tree, is the same reason why he speaks boldly to us here today. He is trying to get our attention that we really have a problem. But moreover, he speaks that way to the tree because he is willing to do what it takes to restore withering trees like you and I. A few days later, as you know, Jesus climbs up Mount Calvary, where he climbs in Mount Calvary the withering tree of death, the cross. And on the cross, Jesus withers away. Why? Because on the cross, Jesus has been cut from the only true source of life, the life which he is one with the Father. On the cross, he is cut off, and therefore he withers away, so that you and I could have the power of God come into our lives to revive us, to restore us, and give us the hope of reflourishing. I love what the Apostle Paul says in Romans 8, chapter 8, verse 11. He is talking about this power that's been given to us in Jesus. And he says this to the church in Rome: if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit who dwells in you. Have you understood these words? Will you allow it to sit? What he's saying is, if you are in Christ, the same spirit that raised Jesus' body from the grave, what a powerful spirit, is the spirit that lives inside of you. And this same Spirit is seeking to restore you, is seeking to revive you, is seeking to bring you back to life and back to health. And here's what I believe this morning to be true, that God, as the ultimate skilled gardener, is here, and I believe that He wants to revive you. He does not want to leave you in hopelessness, but He wants to restore hope in you. He is here to revive you. And as a skilled gardener, He has to use sometimes different methodologies depending on how bad the state of the plant, how bad the state of the tree is. For some of you, it may look like pruning. It may look like pruning. Some of you right now are going through a pruning season. And pruning is very interesting because to the unskilled eye, to the person who is ignorant about botanics and about gardening, when he walks in and he sees a gardener pruning a bush or pruning a tree, he sees all the branches on the floor. It looks like he's destroying the tree. To the untrained eye, it looks like violence. It looks like aggression. It looks like vandalism. But to the expert eye, he is not keeping anything that is a loss to keep and a waste to gain, to stay on the tree. He is pruning the tree so that the tree will flourish. And maybe you're going through a season right now and you don't understand what's happening to you. You're looking to God. You say, God, why are you cutting all these things apart and away from me? You see yourself and you're bleeding from 100 different spots and you have no idea what's happening, what's going on. But He is taking away everything that is a waste to keep in your life. Now, many of you here today may not be undergoing a season of pruning, but maybe some of you here today need more of like a radical move of God. He needs to uproot you. He needs to uproot you from the ground and the soil from which you're in, and He needs to replant you near the streams of living water so that you would get life from Him and from Him alone. And what that means is some of you need to come to faith. This is what rebirth looks like. This is what the new life in Christ looks like. It's to be replanted by the streams of living water. And maybe you're in need of that. But regardless, if you are in a season that you need pruning, or if you're in a season right now that God is calling you to be replanted, if you need pruning, you need to trust what He's doing. You need to trust His skill set. You need to trust His expertise. You need to surrender to His work in your life. It may not look, it may not feel good, but listen, He is at work, and you must surrender. And you must ask Him, hey, God, in this season right now while you're pruning me, even though I don't understand, can you give me perspective of what you are doing in my life? Help me to discern your will. Help me to discern the path that you're opening right in front of me. Help me to discern that which is essential and that which is important, that which I should keep and that which I should lose. And help me to be okay with that. And if you're here today and if you need to be replanted in new soil, this is the moment that you come to Jesus and you say, Jesus, offer me hope. I want to make you my ultimate source of living water. I want to be replanted. I want to restart life. I want a new life, not away from the ultimate source of life, which is you, but next to you. I want my roots to receive the nutrients from you, so that I may flourish. And that is my hope for you today, is that you will flourish so that you will look as great on the inside as you all right now look on the outside. Will you pray with me?